Hello, thank you for this opportunity. I'm David Salama. My grandmother is over here with her hand up. My grandma was born in a small, idyllic, and very Zionistic town called David Horduk that today sits in southern Belarus, close to the Ukrainian border. There she dreamed of one day going to Palestine. She helped give rebirth to the Hebrew language at her Tarbut Jewish day school. And there with her mother, father, and younger brother had a somewhat idyllic childhood. Many Jews from the Detroit area traced their roots to this small town. Almost all of the descendants of Jews who immigrated came here before the Holocaust. My grandmother is unique in that she is one of the few survivors of David Horduk and later the Sarny Ghetto. Growing up, I would hear some of the stories of my grandparents' stories of survival. That my grandfather was in the partisans, that my grandmother managed to survive by hiding, but the details were vague and would come in piecemeal fashion and sometimes in hushed tones, and I did not pry further. In high school, in 1995, I traveled to Poland with USY prior to my first ever time to Israel, and I found my step-grandfather's apartment in Krakow. I knew that I was close, but still far away from where my grandmother's home village was, and her story was still a bit of a mystery. My grandma began to finally tell her story on VHS tapes, first to the Holocaust Museum in South Florida, and later to the Steven Spielberg Shoah Foundation. While these recorded oral stories opened up my grandmother's narrative, I found myself frustrated by the interviewer for not asking follow-up questions that I, as her grandson, wanted to dive deeper into. Finally, with myself settled back in Michigan after my education and training complete, and my grandmother back in Michigan after living in Florida for 30 years, I was able to capitalize on the good luck and fortune of having my grandmother with me as an adult. My grandmother's companion a few years ago, Mort Horowitz of blessed memory, had helped to compile his wife's memoir, and he impressed upon me the importance of putting my grandmother's story into a book format. He arduously interviewed my grandmother and took copious notes. I then transcribed the VHS oral histories from the early 1990s, and then came and interviewed my grandmother herself. My wife and I had the opportunity to travel to David Horduk in the summer of 2016, and I was able to walk the cobblestone streets of my grandmother's town, see where her house probably once stood, where she swam in the Horn River, and where her brother and father are likely buried just outside of the town, when, along with the local Ukrainian villagers, collaborating with the Nazis, had murdered all of the boys and men in August of 1941. I also privately arranged to travel over the Ukrainian border to the town of Sarny, where my grandfather was from, and where the women and children, when they were kicked out of David Horduk, my grandmother and her mother journeyed for 100 kilometers south to reach where they had some cousins and some family, and where shortly thereafter they were placed in the Sarny Ghetto. The Sarny Ghetto was liquidated in August of 1942, and my grandmother, separated from her mother, was thrown into a hiding location half underground that her cousin had built. Only 16 years old at the time, my grandmother's miraculous tale of hiding, often in plain sight of Germans, Nazis, Ukrainians, and others who would surely have killed her if they found out she was Jewish, picks up from here. Later this month, my grandmother will be celebrating her 39th birthday for the 55th time. I am beyond grateful to have her in my life, that she has lived to see her family flourish in the wake of unspeakable horror and tragedy that befell her as a teenager. My grandmother's family was murdered for the simple fact that they were Jewish. She kept her faith, her knowledge and mastery of Hebrew, her Zionistic dreams for 4 years as she went into pure survival mode. She managed to come to America and begin a new family that has risen out of the ashes with 3 daughters, 10 grandchildren, and 17, soon to be 18 great-grandchildren. Our family is grateful to have her in our lives in 2018. Yet I would be remiss not to mention that also in 2018, Jews in this country were murdered just a week ago simply for being Jews. My grandmother's story of survival is an important story to be heard and told. It is not the traditional story of Auschwitz or concentration camp survival, which is probably the most common thread of a narrative when it comes to Holocaust education. My grandmother lived in a small town in Eastern Europe not unlike Anatevka from Fiddler on the Roof. In David Hordak, the Jews faced quiet acceptance but also subversive anti-Semitism from their neighbors, and when the conditions were ripe, unspeakable tragedy befell their town and their community, with the Jews murdered in mass graves just outside of town. It is an important story that needs to be told today in America, more so today than I ever would have thought just 1 week ago.